With that, let's get started. Welcome to this ILCN webinar titled Toward 30 by 30, Unlocking the Potential of Community-Led Conservation in Africa. My name is Robin Beckham, and I'm a policy analyst with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, the organizational home of the International Land Conservation Network. The ILCN is a global network of land conservation practitioners focused on supporting private and civic conservation as a part of the broader large landscape vision. We're excited to host this webinar, which has been assembled and will be moderated by the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association. KWCA has been an important network partner for the ILCN since 2018, when our former director, Jim Levitt, traveled to Africa to meet with private and civic land conservation practitioners, advancing community-led conservation in Kenya, South Africa, and Namibia. Over the past 5 years, we have been working with Karagu Mwangi, an ILCN steering committee member, to strengthen our relationships and network across the continent and better understand how to share those countries' conservation leadership, knowledge, experience, and expertise with our global community of practice. This year, we were honored that KWCA agreed to partner with us as ILCN's regional representative in Africa. KWCA's leadership in advancing community-led conservation that is based on the priorities, needs, and values of landholders is an outstanding example of the whole-of-society approach to conservation that will achieve ambitious targets like 30 by 30. Networks like KWCA and the broader coalition that they are building are key to the success of achieving conservation outcomes that benefit people and nature and enable people to leverage regional and global expertise to drive lasting, large-scale conservation impact. With that, I'd like to invite Dixon Kalo, the CEO of KWCA, to introduce the webinar. Dixon?
Thank you very much, Harriet. Robin, for that introduction of the webinar. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us this morning, afternoon, on this ILCN webinar series focused on Africa. Africa represents 20% of the global land area and presents an outsized opportunity to conserve global biodiversity with its population of nearly 5 million people and also growing to 2.5 billion estimate by 2050, and also a continent that has more intact wild places and functioning systems compared to other parts of the world, and one that is recognized to offer an opportunity for cheaper conservation compared to the cost of doing conservation elsewhere, considering that a conservation dollar in Africa goes further than elsewhere. So welcome, and today we are going to have a conversation around community-led conservation. We will understand what it is, how it's being practiced, and we welcome you to be part of that conversation through the chat, the question and answer session at the end of this webinar. To start us off, just to set the scene, I would like to welcome Dr. Harriet Davis-Mossad from representing the Conserve Global as an Executive Director of Impact. Dr. Harriet has over 25 years of experience working in impact strategy, policy, practice, and especially focused on translating conservation research to practical locally led solution. That presentation will give us a background of where conservation in Africa, focusing especially on community-led, community conserved areas and privately conserved areas. And then I'll follow up with a short presentation on our current understanding, evolving understanding of community-led conservation. And we have amazing panelists joining us today to get into this discussion. So feel welcome and participate through the chat and the question and answer session. So I will at this point bring in Dr. Harriet Davis to make a presentation on the current state of Africa's land conservation. You're welcome.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much to ILCN and KWCA and colleagues for convening this really important discussion. As Dixon said, I'm going to take the next few minutes just to step back and look at the bigger picture of conservation across Africa and hopefully set the stage for the discussion on the community-led conservation that follows. As many of you will know, under the Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted in 2022, countries committed to conserving 30% of land and sea by 2030. Globally, we're currently at about 17% of land under protection. So the ambition is to nearly double the coverage of this within the next decade. But it's really important to remember that this target's not just about designating more land. It explicitly calls for conservation that is effectively managed, ecologically representative and connected, and very importantly, equitably governed. And so from the outset, 30 by 30 is as much about how we conserve as it is about how much we conserve. And so where does Africa currently stand? If we look at the formal protected areas, they cover around 15% of the continent's land area and about 16% of its marine and coastal areas. These estimates vary slightly due to differences in data sets and definitions and different calculation methods. But this translates to about 4.4 million square kilometers of terrestrial and inland waters across nearly 9,000 protected areas. And these protected areas aren't simply the iconic national parks that we all know, but they encompass a huge diversity of different governance types. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is an extensive network of national parks that encompass about 850,000 square kilometers. But about 2/3 of sub-Saharan Africa's conservation state sits outside of these national parks. And this includes former hunting blocks, such as wildlife management areas in Tanzania, katadas in Mozambique, game management areas in Zambia. And it also includes community conservancies in countries like Namibia and Kenya. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that with Dixon's talk shortly. But many of these areas are now underperforming, either due to declining revenues, for example, because of the decline in the hunting industry globally, or because of limited local benefits that these deliver. So although there's been a significant progress over the past few decades, which in many ways reflects strong political commitment and investment across the continent, it also means that on paper, Africa is only about halfway to the 30% target. And that on paper qualifier really does matter. Because when we shift from maps to reality on the ground, a very different picture emerges. Across Africa, most wildlife and biodiversity exists outside of formal protected areas. And some estimates suggest that up to 80% of species occur on community lands and mixed-use landscapes. And these are, very importantly, these are working landscapes. So they are rangelands, community forests, fishing grounds, places where people live, work, and manage natural resources every day. It's estimated that about 60% of sub-Saharan Africa's population is rural, and more than 60% of rural people in sub-Saharan Africa are totally reliant on these natural ecosystems for food, water, energy, health, and secure livelihoods. So the functioning of these systems is critical to livelihoods. And the key point here is that while protected areas are critical, they do not capture the majority of Africa's biodiversity. And this brings us to what we might call the hidden conservation state. Across Africa, a large proportion of land is held under customary tenure and community governance. Often this is the majority in many countries, but much of this is not formally recognized and it's poorly mapped, largely invisible in national and global reporting. And so while the official figures on the World Database of Protected Areas suggest that 14 to 16% are conserved, the reality is that much more land is being actively managed in ways that support biodiversity, but it isn't being recognized as such. And so what does this mean for progress towards 30 by 30? I mean, we've seen that there's real momentum. So protected area networks are expanding. There's growing recognition of more diverse governance models, including other effective area-based conservation measures or OECMs. And there's also strong regional commitment coming out of things like the African Protected Area Congress and related processes. This includes the Kigali Call to Action, which is a continent-wide commitment by African stakeholders to transform conservation by placing people, and particularly indigenous peoples and local communities, at its very center, while scaling up equitable, well-financed and effective systems of protected and conserved areas to achieve biodiversity, climate and development goals. But despite this positive momentum, Africa still needs to roughly double the area under conservation within the next few years. And critically, that expansion cannot simply follow the past models because the biggest opportunities lie outside the formal protected area network. So there are a few well-recognized challenges that shape this landscape, and I think Dixon's going to come into some of these too, but financing remains far below what's needed for long-term management. Governance and capacity varies very widely, with many areas are under-resourced. Equity and rights issues continue to persist, and particularly around land tenure and decision-making. And data gaps mean that community-managed areas remain poorly recognized and tracked, especially on global tracking systems. So taken together, this points to a system that's not yet aligned with how conservation actually happens across Africa. And this is where community-led conservation becomes really central. So if most biodiversity exists outside of protected areas, then really simply there's no viable pathway to 30 by 30 in Africa without communities. And community-led conservation matters because it aligns with where biodiversity actually exists. It builds on existing systems of stewardship. As Dixon has already said, it's cost-effective and sustainable over time. And importantly, it supports livelihoods and local governance. So this is not just a complementary approach. It's a core pillar of how 30 by 30 will be achieved in Africa. So just to leave you with a few key takeaway messages. So firstly, Africa is not starting from zero. There's been real progress. We've expanded our protected areas. We're getting better at effectively managing them. But secondly, protected areas are not enough by themselves. They capture only part of the conservation picture. And thirdly, the largest opportunity lies outside of formal parks and landscapes that are already managed by communities. And finally, recognizing, supporting, and scaling community-led conservation is likely the fastest, most cost-effective, most equitable pathway to achieving 30 by 30 in Africa. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope this provides some useful framing for the conservation that follows, particularly around how we better recognize and support community-led conservation, how we align policy and finance with reality on the ground, and also how we ensure that 30 by 30 is delivered in a way that is both effective and just. Thanks.
A very big thanks to Dr. Harriet for that opening presentation that sets us the stage. I think your point on we are only halfway in Africa through our protected area approach, and that even though we are halfway, that half that has already been protected under national parks, national reserves, and government-managed protected areas only represent what Africa offers. And I think your point on species and habitat they depend on is really out there and in spaces that we under manage, under fund, and more importantly, under monitor. And that these really represent the chance for Africa to achieve their 30 by 30 targets. It really insightful story. And from your role as the regional vice chair of the East and Southern Africa IUCN Annual Commission on Protected Areas gives you a good point. And so we are really positioned to look at. So we are really privileged to have you in this discussion today. So thank you for that presentation. You've brought in an important topic and you defined it as community-led conservation. So I would like to spend a few minutes to just take us through what really is community-led conservation as understood by majority of the people that are in this webinar today and those that are panelists working on the ground. So community-led conservation has potential to afford Africa the opportunity to exceed the 30 by 30 target as described under the Global Biodiversity Framework. But just what is community-led conservation? Next. So you've brought in a key point that majority of the world, and especially Africa, is not protected, is not under any legal regime managed by government under the protected area. And knowing that populations globally, and even more in Africa, is growing, there is a real challenge on how do we maintain the biodiversity and the habitat they utilize. We already know that Africa has lost up to 73%, and there are different figures that are shared, but there is a recognition that in the last 2 to 5 decades, Africa has lost significantly a higher proportion of its wildlife. And looking at the drivers of these biodiversity loss, habitat loss is a key driver. And so community-led conservation is really the solution to addressing the key driver of biodiversity loss, which is the fragmentation, fencing, and subdivision and conversion of wild habitat and where biodiversity occur. And so we are then going to think about how can community-led conservation become the pillar that it can be. Next. So to do this, Africa is going through a shift from protection to inclusive conservation. I think from time immemorial, Africa is well known for coexistence between people and wildlife, people and nature, and people and biodiversity. Traditional cultures were dependent on functioning ecosystems, and they acted through social norms, lifestyles, and cultural behaviors to really protect their environment for the purposes of their own sustenance. So Africa is known as the cradle of mankind, but also the place for coexistence. Then in the early 1900s, the protected area approach was brought in. And the thing we are tracking here is to what extent are communities living adjacent these areas were involved. A lot of the time, there is a little bit of consultation that happens in the creation of national parks, natural reserves, and what have you. But often communities that live adjacent this area talk about exclusion, talk about failure for them to access resources. And oftentimes they are seen as the problem to the conservation challenge for these protected areas. Recognizing this challenge, and because most of the wildlife and habitat have been damaged as a result of inaction by communities, multiple stakeholders began developing what for many years we've called community-based conservation. This is conservation where communities participate. And more recently, recognizing the failure of the networks of community-based conservation projects, there is a big shift that's now happening around communities being in leadership, in decision-making, and in taking action to protect their own natural resources. Next. So what's the difference between community-based conservation and community-led conservation? Very similar terms. They are used in the same space in different times, but there are subtle differences, and it's important to know the stage at which communities are involved, because only when communities are fully involved and are in leadership do we begin to see conservation outcomes. The definition, first of all, is that in community-based conservation, communities participate. In community-led conservation, they drive and they own the conservation agenda. In terms of decision-making, the communities are centered. They are the ones, their decisions count, their decisions matter. And in community-based conservation, mostly it's designed top-down by NGOs and by governments and brought to the communities, and communities passive participants and often seen as beneficiaries. The initiators for community-based conservation are often external funders and external initiators, and sometimes the private sector. In community-led conservation, the supporters are simply enablers, but the community themselves are taking action, building on what they already know. And then, of course, in terms of ownership, stronger sustainability happen when there is strong local ownership. And really the shift needs to happen, needs to be accelerated for all conservation outside state protected areas to become community-led, because that's where success and sustainability will happen. Next. So here's a quick attempt on what we define, how we define community-led conservation by those that practice it. It's basically a conservation practice where local communities take the primary lead in decision-making, in management, and also that they derive benefits from the management of their land. And there are 4 pillars. First of all is a very strong sense of ownership. And you'll hear words like our being used often when community conservation becomes community-led. It's about the people who live within the area driving the conservation agenda, prioritizing their needs, and being supported by external actors. It's also about being practical in integrating cultural and knowledge systems of those communities that live in. And often there is a strong local organization that has been set up and having been capacitated to deliver the conservation outcomes. Next. The Africa Convention under the African Union on Nature and Natural Resources already recognizes the importance of community-owned and privately owned areas. In its Article 12.3, it states that countries that are party to the Africa Union, which in principle is all African countries, shall promote the establishment by local communities of areas managed by them, primarily for the purpose of conserving biodiversity. And we will be very glad for those that are able to join us this afternoon to hear your experiences from your own countries and how this principle is being rolled out in different countries. Within Africa, and especially focused on the Eastern and Southern Africa, we already see an emergence of networks of community-run areas. They have different names: community participatory forest areas, community conservancies, wildlife management areas, and different names. Different names are being used, and they are growing in terms of numbers, in terms of coverage, and in terms of complexity in the governance model that they are developing. And so the big question that we will be grappling with through this webinar and in future is how to strengthen them so that they account to the journey towards 30 by 30. Next. The key elements of community-led conservation, and I quickly summarize them as the secure land rights and rights over resources, access, recognized by government and other stakeholders. It's also about governance, good governance, equitable governance, where communities' decisions really count in practice as their action as well. And communities themselves are the implementers of those decisions that are being made on a day-to-day basis. It's also important to recognize the importance of benefits, either monetary benefits or non-monetary benefits, and also at the household level and at the community level. Only when these 3 elements exist do we begin to see community-led conservation working in practice. Next. Yeah, so there are several gaps, just briefly: lack of voice, lack of undocumented impact, and written playbook in terms of how it looks like and how it's recognized. And most important, as Harriet did say, is lack of funding. And so the remaining part of today, this webinar, will be having a discussion with 4 of my panelists who will unfold and share their own experiences on what is happening in their own countries. We have 4 panelists from 4 different countries within Africa, over 70 years of experience collectively, and even more importantly, they are walking their communities on the journey to strengthen community-led conservation. So in welcoming our panelists, we have Sam Shaba, who is the CEO of Honey Guide Foundation. Sam has worked in natural resource management that is focused on improving livelihoods, and he holds an MBA in conservation leadership and works in Tanzania. We unfortunately did not have Dr. Rogers Lubilo, who was supposed to join us for now, but we have Charlotte Ganes, who is joining us from Namibia to Audi Conservancy, Kunene Conservancy Association, Community Conservancies and Community Forests, and she's developing an innovative scaled leadership within within Namibia. So welcome, panelists. We will have a few questions, and then we will take your final opportunity to listen from you as webinar participants, or connect with us as we go to on in this discussion. Let me start by asking the panelists today who are here with us on what their understanding of community-led conservation is and how it is shaping out in their respective countries. So share your experience from Tanzania. Sam, can you hear me?
Dixon, yes, thank you very much. Can you tell me the question one more time? You were breaking up a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, now I can hear you. Tell me.
Yeah, so your question is the
Dixon, I'm sorry. I think we are really struggling to hear you with your connection. Is it possible? Do you have a different network you could join?
And Robin, if you got the question, so help me.
Sam, can you hear me?
Yeah, try now.
Okay, sorry about that. We seem to be having some technical issue here. So community-led conservation is widely promoted across Africa. But many initiatives are still delivered to communities rather than by communities. What best distinguishes genuine leadership in community-led conservation from your experience in Tanzania, as you also use yourself?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dixon. You've said it, and I will just emphasize it in how we define it from our work in Tanzania. I would say the simplest test for it to really be community-led would be who controls the decisions. And then in follow-up of that is who controls the distribution of the benefits. And if I was to put it in now, value that in very simple terms, I would say who can say no to conservation. And that would be a very bold and huge test to some of us, especially NGOs supporting community conservation, where could we genuinely say community could have said no? Or is it forced onto them by whatever forces that could be forcing them? Could be government, could be a lot of money from conservationists promised, That makes it really hard for community to say no, or a few benefiting from that money saying yes on behalf of many who would have otherwise said no. I think that would be the very big test, in my opinion. Many initiatives, like you said, Dixon, are externally designed. Someone else sitting somewhere far away from these landscapes, designing a project, normally very short project cycles, and then putting it on community land. And community are just participating. They are welcomed to the launch of these projects. They get a school or a dam or a borehole as a benefit, but they really didn't have the chance to say no, and they don't really control the day-to-day management of conservation initiatives that are put in place. We shouldn't really call it community-led when it's like that. We should maybe call it community participated conservation or community based. It's conservation that is done on community land, but it wouldn't be community led if a community couldn't have said no. They don't participate in day-to-day management. They don't have access rights to this natural resource. That would be challenged, and I would doubt we would call it community led. That would be my response from Tanzanians' point of view, Dixon.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think you bring in a very important point around, do the communities have a room to say no? Can they disagree? Are they the ones that are making decisions, or decisions are being made by them? Let's listen from Charlotte from Namibia. Namibia is one of the leaders in Africa in community conservation. How do you describe community-led conservation from your perspective?
Community-led conservation, in my view, is when communities are being the rights to control, decide, and also at the same time be able to benefit from these resources, rather than just like Mr. Sam said, being given this task to basically perform. So basically, community-led conservation is communities owning up to this conservation, taking part, making decisions, and being involved in these processes.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So similarities exist across the different countries, and if Rogers was here, he would have also emphasized on that point on what is the role of the communities, and is it genuinely communities involving themselves in their own conservation effort, or being invited by others? And often, even for example, in Kenya, we see that the protected area thinking is still flowing into community areas. And in many cases, you find that what we call community managed areas are basically community lands where protected area approaches are being used. And so it really need to be clear on how the communities are involved and what level of decision. Now let's switch back to 30 by 30. 30 by 30 was largely shaped by governments in global discussion. 30% of the areas to be managed and conserved by 2030. These are international forum decisions. I would like to ask you both around, how aware are your communities in wildlife management areas in conservancies on 30 by 30? And what practical relevance is associated with the 30 by 30 target within your areas?
Dixon, if I could start. In places where we work, local like CSO groups, communities living next to national parks, the local communities who interact with wildlife day to day, they do not wake up in the morning thinking about 30 by 30. They think about land security, they think about grazing pressures, they think about elephants destroying their crops, they think about water, about jobs. They really think about whether wildlife has real value to their future. The 30 by 30 is something that is discussed at international conferences, international groups. It's designed, decided, and elsewhere. The closest participants of discussing 30 by 30 will be maybe the environment ministries and natural resource ministries, the governments of these places. But we've already heard from Harriet that the risk is, even though that target was made, we know why that was made and how important it is to the future of the Earth. So it's a very valuable target because we are all in trouble if we don't reach it. But the reality is we have run out of land that can be core protected areas. Harriet said it, without these areas outside core protected areas, we won't reach that target. And when we don't reach that target, the rich, the poor, the rural, and the towns, everyone will be in trouble. So we have to figure out how can we secure more land, put it to that 30 by 30 target that were designed very, very far from this community land, and get community to care and to want this to happen. Why would someone living next to a national park care about demarcating a piece of land to conservation and smile about it, be happy to do so, protect it, value it, and keep it protected for wildlife? It's something we really have to crack our minds, because we can't go to community and say, we want that because of 30 by 30. We have to be able to say, we want that because it will secure grazing. We want that because it will secure water. We want that because it will secure livelihoods. If that promise cannot be made confidently, community will not be convinced that they will just do it for 30 by 30. That would be my response there, and the relevance here in Tanzania. When wildlife management areas, the ones that really work are the ones that have proven to touch people's hearts and lives, not the ones that have proved to secure more land. So it's less about the hectares protected, it's more about the amount of people who are happy of keeping it conserved.
So it's really a point of what is it in for the community. And so global targets have their own ambition, but that needs to be matched with the ambition of the communities. And I think if we can get both right so that it serves the community, it serves global targets, then we will be beginning to make progress.
Yes,
let's shift
and
to
even in the 30 by 30 target, it says it has to be well governed, it has to be well managed, it has to be well protected, and all the human rights and the legal rights, access rights to natural resources has to be there. It can't be just a piece of land demarcated. There's much more that needs to be done for it to count towards that target.
Yeah, thank you so much. And let's also hear from Harriet, from Charlotte on the case in Namibia. Namibia has a network of over 86 conservancies run by communities. How aware are these communities on 30 by 30?
In my experience, many community members may not be familiar with the term 30 by 30 itself, but they are very familiar with the principles behind it. For example, communities understand the importance of protecting wildlife, managing natural resources sustainably, and ensuring that future generations continue to benefit from healthy ecosystems. In Namibia, communities have been contributing to biodiversity conservation for decades, like over having 38 conservancies and more than 46 community forests, which is covering about 20% of Namibia's land. And those landscapes are being managed by local communities who are already making a sufficient contribution to the global conservation targets. So for many communities, conservation is not only about protecting nature, It is about creating jobs, creating income through tourism and sustainable natural resource uses, strengthening local governance, also preventing cultural heritage and building resilience to climate change. Therefore, I see an opportunity to ensure that community-led conservation receives the recognition, policy support, and investment it deserves. In Namibia, community has been already contributing to conservation through CPRN program, which is the community-based natural resource management, and communities lies in the recognition of their roles as custodians of biodiversity and holding their rights. So that's how it's working in Namibia and in my experience.
Yeah, thank you so much. We see quite some commonality there. In Kenya as well, we see that communities themselves are focusing on how they can better manage their lands to take care of livestock and to be able to access natural assets. And so we see a disconnect between global policy and community action, and the need to narrow that gap. And so one of the key take home points is how can we bring the 30 by 30 targets, target 3, and all other targets more to understanding of the community, so that even as they do their work, they are also aware that they are supporting global and Africa citizens to arrive at this target. We also in Kenya see quite a bit of sometimes a push against conservation, the understanding that creating conservation is equal to creating a protected area. And so communities that have had a history of exclusion are working against conservation in sometimes thinking that maybe the push to create more areas means that some of their land is going to be taken away by government. And so there is a knowledge gap within communities that need to be addressed. And it's also relatively clear in many countries that the targets are driving governments to take action. There is, at least in Kenya, more interest to support conservancies today than there were before the targets. And there is already even government efforts to support conservancies with water points, with the resources for them to achieve conservation outcome. And it will be useful at some point, Harriet, if you can step in to maybe just speak to us a little bit about what you see as the future prospects of integrating community-led conservation efforts within the 30 by 30 targets. But as you come to that, I want us to basically look at one more question related to that. Community-led conservation often creates new institutions. There are already community-run institutions at the community level. And the question is, how do they overlap these new legal institutions that are created vis-a-vis those traditional governance arrangements? And what tensions do you sometimes see in your areas? And how can we better reconcile conservation institutions at the community level with the traditional institutional structures? Sam, if you want to go for that.
Yeah. There is, to your question, Dixon, that often, even when we talk about community-led, community is not a homogeneous group. It's a lot of people we're talking about. And even within those groups, there are subgroups of subgroups. What we are trying to figure out when we work on community-led conservation is, how are they going to be governed? How are the decisions going to be made that are representatives of the many? Because any way to work with this entity requires an institution that runs the decision making, the day-to-day management, the distribution of benefits, the management of the losses, all that cannot be done by, for example, in Tanzania, 20,000 people who are members of a wildlife management area. Any financing that would come, let's say it's from a business such as tourism, such as carbon, they need to sit with a selective few, negotiate, enter into contracts and work with them. NGOs wanting to support conservation, they cannot work with all these multiple entities. So using an example in Tanzania, 20,000 people, members of this land, so let's consider them shareholders, they have a stake because they put their land and allocated it to conservation, and they are expecting return on that investment. There is a necessity for them to figure out how to elect or find a few who will represent their voices. And that would be the governance structure we talked about earlier. And then the governance makes decision. It is critical that they figure out also how to remove the role of day-to-day management from that governing organ. Separate governance function, separate day-to-day management function. They need to be separated. As soon as you have that, shareholders of the business, the governance board, whatever you call it, and the management team, manager, accountant, rangers, you already have an institution. It's necessary. Without it, it will not go anywhere. No one will be able to interact with this area. Now, how powerful this institution is, they could be there as an institution, but they do not call the shot. It's another NGO, it's the government, it's whatever else, the philanthropy who brought them the money, or one very powerful investor who has a concession, who calls the shot. That's where you have this entity, but it's dysfunctional. If you have this entity and it is in charge and it's well governed, professionally managed, we say we have an institution that works and it is community-led and it is representative of the many. I will pause there, Dixon. I'm trying to justify why an institution is necessary. And you can't have that institution outsourced, done by someone else. It's no longer community-led when that is the case.
Yeah, quite true that, in some form of institution will emerge. And I'm sure also for Namibia, you have your conservancies, but there are also those traditional institutions by the communities themselves that existed pre-communities engaging in conservancies. And so maybe from your experience, because you work on the ground, how do you see the new institution and the traditional institution working together and what the challenge could be? Charlotte?
Basically working together does not, at the end of the day, create confusion or challenges, but then what we have experienced is each institution is having their mandates, and then forgetting that all these mandates, they would be going to the same communities. So basically it's clutching when it comes to institutions having to carry out their duties and their responsibilities, whilst at the end of the day it is just one communities, rather than getting together to find solutions which would best work for the communities. So basically following out their mandates is clutching with the communities, and then it's disadvantaging the communities at the end of the day.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing that example. And it's really a tension that sometimes can exist when you have traditional institutions that have persisted over the years, are known by the community traditionally, and then new institutions must emerge for communities to have a say and a voice and a legal recognition. And to the extent that these traditional and modern institutions, how they can be brought together to work together, and how new institutions that emerge are building on existing traditional institutions to the extent that there are similarity in the way they function, and really points to what you said earlier about it cannot be imported from elsewhere because local context is important. And so those are some of the challenges that I guess you all deal with and you have shared. Collectively, if I may just share, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia, and Kenya have 398 community conserved areas as conservancies, wildlife management areas covering some 45 million hectares of land. That is land that is rich in biodiversity that needs to be accounted for under the 30 by 30. Harriet, could you share with us how you will see better recognition, better inclusion, and better tracking of community areas into the future?
Great, thanks, Dixon. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, but I think we can also frame the question. It's not about integrating. I mean, I think, as I said in my comment, my presentation earlier, it's actually fundamental to reaching 30 by 30. So this is not an optional thing. I think it's something that actually, it absolutely must happen. A huge amount of biodiversity lies outside of formal protected areas, and as we've seen, if we don't bring community-led conservation into, very formally into this process, we're not going to get to where we need to get to. But I think, the policy framework for this is almost there. I mean, it's mostly there. We know that the Global Biodiversity Framework has called for equitable governance, and it recognizes equitable governance and diverse governance forms in order to meet its targets. And I touched on earlier about the other effective area-based conservation mechanisms. And, so there are some kind of global mechanisms by which we can absolutely recognize the already existing work that communities are doing to protect biodiversity. I spoke about the hidden conservation estate. We need to bring that to the fore there, and there's a lot of efforts been made to expand the World Database on protected areas in order to include OECMs and to recognize these. And I think we have a responsibility and a duty as African conservation leaders and scientists and practitioners and community members to make sure that that we lead the race in this. I think there's a real opportunity for Africa to really push for including these diverse types of land use into global targets. So I'm really excited about it. And I think the real gap is in implementation. So we know that community areas are poorly mapped. Because of the diversity of governance, it's often not clear. Definitions are difficult to sort of pin down. That makes it hard for anybody who's trying to, map global targets and understand statistics. And so there's sort of an inherent complexity to the system that makes it challenging. But we can work on this. I think it's certainly not insurmountable. And we, as you've said in the discussion earlier, it's got to be something as well that we work on communicating effectively across all levels. There's been a huge work done by the IUCN recently. My colleague Daniel Marnowick, who heads up the area-based work there, has done incredible work trying to get governments to start to understand what this, these OECM, this definition is. And if we can keep pushing this envelope, I think that we will make big progress towards getting community-led conservation recognized. One last point I just wanted to say, it was a question that you asked Sam and Charlotte, about whether communities are aware of this idea of 30 by 30. And I think this disconnect between what needs to happen globally, but then what people's lived experience is something that as a collective, as a community of practice, we need to put our heads together to try to make that connection and try to link this up, because we all know that without 30 by 30, the world is in trouble. And we all know that communities have the most, certainly for Africa, one of the most important roles to play. And so how do we line things up so that that we're achieving both? And so, yeah.
Yeah, so there is a bit of work to be done to ensure that all these community-led conserved areas also account. And so thank you for that for sharing that experience and those opportunities that is being discussed in different places. I think this could be one of the things that jointly, as those who are participating with us today, we can continue the conversation around how best to track and how best to monitor and how to include community-led conserved areas in the 30 by 30 targets. Now let's shift a little bit to two key ingredients that are important for community-led conservation to work. Strong legal frameworks, land rights, and management of conflicts. Again, communities are not one homogeneous group. There are many. They have their own differences. And I just want to spend a few more minutes talking about how is the legal framework shaping and what needs to happen more so that community managed areas are recognized in law, but also more importantly, that the communities themselves feel supported by the existing land laws and environmental policies in their respective countries, and therefore how conflicts can be mitigated. Let me start with Charlotte from Namibia. You have all these networks of conservancies, and Namibia is recognized as one of the countries that has advanced its legal framework in support of community conserved areas. Share your experiences and if gaps, if there are. Charlotte.
From Namibia's experience, I believe it is important that legal requisition of communities as right holders over the natural resources that they manage. So our success did not happen by choice. I think it was enabled by the strong legal and policy frameworks that we have in Namibia, the roles that the conservancies play in the conservation and sustainable development. Our conservation's foundation is basically from the Namibian constitution, whereby in the constitution that there is a provision created for basics for community involvement in natural resources management. Also, there is an involvement from Namibia's Nature Conservation Amendment Acts that allows communities to have and to manage resources under which is granted to communal land area residents rights over wildlife management, tourism, and communities become legal custodians of wildlife and could establish conservancies, enter into tourism partnerships, and benefit directly. In addition, we also have Forestry Act, which enables community forest creations, how communities can benefit from forest resources. And also, we also have Communal Land Reform Act, which also further strengthens the tenure security by recognizing customary land rights and establishing ways in how this registration and protections can happen. So together, I think those laws have transformed communities from passive beneficiaries, or rather than just receiving, on the other hand, into being active right holders and decision makers.
Yeah, so thank you. The important role of the legal change, advancing the changes in legal policy, and as you rightly say, recognizing the communities are the owners of the land as the custodian of the resources and the beneficiaries of the work that they are doing stands out. And I think this has driven the success of the Namibia Conservancy model. In Tanzania, how is the legal framework looking like, and what are some of the lessons you learned in terms of land, in terms of advancing the legal framework?
I wouldn't know how to respond to that, Dixon, without getting myself into trouble, but I'll try. Let's say you have a backyard that has good grass, you own that land. and your neighbor has horses that also are grazing in their backyard, but they need more land. So they would like to also graze on yours. Um, who needs to ask for permission to earn money that is made by tourists coming to look over the fence and see those horses? Is it you owning the backyard and have grass more than that you need and you want your neighbor to use? Or is it your neighbor who has the horses and they want to use more than their own backyard? That's the situation in Tanzania. The government owns wildlife everywhere wildlife is. Community have rights to their land that the wildlife also uses. But community have to seek permission every time they have to earn or benefit from wildlife on their land. And that's the legal framework in Tanzania. It's as soon as you have wildlife on your land, regardless, it is your land, it's your kids' land, it's your neighbor's land. As long as you have wildlife, that ownership and rights to that land is really starts to really fade or between you and government. Even though the rights have been devolved to make these wildlife management areas, there's still a lot of influence, governance, decision-making power that is retained by central government. And that's the situation in Tanzania today.
Yeah, I'm sure it's quite similar to many other countries. I can quickly just share the Kenyan experience. We've advanced a lot on the legal framework for conservancies, particularly since our organization was established. And we still see a big gap, especially when it comes to unregistered community lands. We do have large areas of our membership of community managed areas that do not have the legal registration of the land or lack the enforcement capacity, the implementation of even existing laws. Then when communities begin developing their conservation areas and they become successful and they have lots of grass and probably they have investment that has gone in, it becomes very difficult for them to sustain over the long term. And especially it also create conflicts because those who run out of grass will then go to those who have the grass and who are managing it, but do not have the legal rights over it. And I think all of us are pointing to the point that legal frameworks in Africa, in African countries, need to advance to recognize, to support, to empower the communities that are actually managing these areas. Because if that doesn't happen in tandem, then the successes of these communities and their conserved areas become quite limiting. So quite interesting comment when it comes to land rights and also. So let's quickly shift to our last question around finance. Harriet did mention, and I also did emphasize, that today's global funding has not been designed to serve community-led conservation. And so what is your experience and what do you see as the change that needs to happen in global funding and also enterprise with private sector partnership to make these community conserved areas both effective and also sustaining in the long term as prescribed under the global biodiversity targets? Sam, you want to go for that?
I could go, but I was being lazy and asking Harriet to go first.
No problem, we can have Harriet.
Yeah, if we are talking about financing, there's something I also wrote in the chat. The biggest barrier right now is that the financing architecture has not been designed to get down to local institutions. That capacity thing I typed in the chat, it looks like communities and the local institutions have to have capacity to be able to access, to be able to absorb, to be able to manage funding, but there is at the same time not enough attention or funding to build that capacity. So it seems like these local institutions are locked in a bubble where no investments to building the capacity.
Sam is frozen for me. I don't know if everyone else also. Harriet, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with some thoughts on this topic while Sam reconnects.
Yes, as we wait for some.
Sorry, I was talking and I wasn't muted. I was muted. I'm happy to jump in while we wait for Sam, but I would just, like to agree with what he was saying about the fact that the current financing architecture is not set up for, for a disbursement of funds to local communities, and I think this is one of the things that creates challenges because as Dixon, the table that you presented in your talk about what is community-based natural resource management versus community-led conservation, and one of these things is that it's not driven by NGOs, it's not driven by external parties. But NGOs are set up to, take money. There are machines designed to find funding and get resources and deploy them. And so there's a sort of an inherent disjunct there between what needs to actually happen, which is that the funds and the support and the finance go directly to community structures. And then, what is actually happening, which is that often there's these NGO channels that, the money flows through. So I think that's the one very big constraint. I think another one is that, conservation funding and, if all of you who are listening to this webinar, I'm sure will have experienced the same thing. It's set up to be project-based. And so it's set up for short-term, maybe 3-year deliverables, with, proper outcomes and targets and so on, and reporting. When what we're talking about with community-based, community-led conservation, as certainly in the context of area-based conservation and how it can contribute to 30 by 30, we talk about really long-term time horizons here. So the structure of the funding doesn't suit what actually needs to happen in terms of just long-term program-based work that is just supporting communities to manage their resources and make their decisions. And so, yeah, I think those are two quite fundamental structural issues that we need to try and overcome. I'm not going to get into any of the actual sort of technical stuff around innovative finance because even that, I mean, the third piece is, the real like high value things that can unlock funding, beyond tourism, which has been traditionally, one of the funding revenue streams, are things like carbon and biodiversity credits. And these are complex, very complex and tricky systems that, haven't been fully optimized yet. And so there's also a sort of technical challenge there about getting this kind of funding and projects working to unlock these resources for communities who sometimes, we're working with people who are not literate potentially, or, certainly haven't had, I mean, none of us have had that much exposure to international finance. So, I think those are three things that I would say are a challenge, and it's something that we need to overcome. But Sam's back, so he can rescue me from this.
Thank you so much. Briefly, Sam, if you can finalize
just one suggestion I would have is because of the lack of capacity, because of the technical challenges Harriet spoke about, we need organizations, funders, philanthropy who are genuine about building these local institutions up, investing by accessing the capital that exists now from philanthropy enough to be able to build these local institutions so they can access future financing. Community alone, even with good governance and management, cannot develop a carbon project, cannot develop a biodiversity credit. And also, NGOs can happen to be barriers to what NGOs to exist into the future. So block that capacity at NGO level so we can continue to be relevant. If we can have enough very genuine NGOs that really care about building that capacity, and at the time as that capacity is being built, use the technical expertise that NGO can have to build the businesses that communities will own, then we can slowly phase ourselves down into the picture when community are now doing business and earning money of their own from like proper businesses, not funding, not donor funding.
Thank you so much. We've had a good discussion, stepping from policy change, recognition of community-led conserved areas, talking about the need for the right kind of money at the right time, thinking about building local institution, funding impact rather than projects, building local institutions. All these are important ingredients. In the interest of the time we have, I would like to now switch a little bit to interact with our participants who have been able to join us. I've seen quite a number of comments, quite a number of questions, including some really interesting information, recommendations rather. So we can just take a few questions and comments from the group.
Thanks, Dixon. We have a few questions in the Q&A if you'd like to pose those questions to our panelists. It should be visible on the top and bottom of your screen. It's a separate box from the chat.
Just a second.
I can start with the first one, is Dixon you're picking, but feel free to pick the ones you think we should respond to. So the first one is talking about how practical is it to measure areas under community-led conservation? How can we ensure sustainability and stability of such areas? In my response to that would be, we will need to first agree what success looks like. When do we say it is successful? What we need to see. In my opinion, and the work that we do in Tanzania, a community-led conservation area is successful when it is financially self-sustaining, so it's not dependent on donor subsidy. It's socially valued, so we can prove majority of the people are happy with it being a conservation area. It's it's ecologically secure, that we can prove that the ecosystem is not losing habitats and wildlife. And institutionally, it's resilient. The governance and the management at the hands of communities themselves can take it forward without existence of external support. That would be, if we can agree to that, then we can all work towards getting that unlocked. Many more of these communities can be sustainable and they are not dependent on short-term projects and donor support.
Thank you so much for those comments. We also have a question from Peter, who is talking about the need for social infrastructure, particularly supporting member-based networks. And really, this is a very important and interesting question, given that some of us that are represented here today are leading and working in those networks. And across Africa, we've seen an emergence of network. In Uganda, we have Umoja Wildlife Conservancies, the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies, the Wildlife Management Area Consortium in Tanzania with Honey Guide and CBNRM forums, and also the organizations that Charlotte leads in Namibia. So these aggregators bring the voice that is lacking. They are also important in creating the enabling environment for funding to flow to these local communities. It may become impractical for funders to actually reach every community, but having these member-based aggregators of community-led action at the landscape level, at the ecosystem level, and also at the national level, in the Kenyan experience have been really important. So making resources available and technical support to these member networks that are supporting community-led conservation is a key pillar in really making community-led conservation more sustainable. There is also a question about 30 by 30 and also using the 30 by 30 as a leveraging tool and also in defining policy. I don't know, Harriet, if you want to say a word around how can community-led conservation actors through their networks accelerate their funding support and technical support through the 30 by 30 as the instrument and the tool.
Great, thank you, Dixon. I think it goes in both directions. So I think on one hand, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that finding ways for community networks to be able to explain the opportunities that potentially exist, by 30 by 30 to their community constituents and their networks. I think that that's important, but I also think it's equally important for donors and funders and investors to understand more about community-led conservation. So how do we reach those networks of donors and investors? Recently we had a meeting of the Biodiversity Funders Network, and we were talking about OECMs in Africa to a group of funders and donors that don't really know much about this very technical term. And how do we show that OECMs, for example, in Africa could provide a very equitable way to reach our 30 by 30 targets, and that their funding and their support can make a big difference. So it's about, again, the top meeting the bottom, and grassroots up and funders down. I think really important.
Exactly. There is also a question on how can we ensure that community-led conservation gives communities secure land rights. And that question resonates well with me because that's what we do in our network. We focus on looking at policy advocacy. And so we work closely with government at the national level, at the local level, to look at what are the barriers to secure land rights. And that means driving policy change. It also means bringing the resources to support the communities. It also means educating the communities to understand how their rights to land is organized in the country. And I think even more importantly, there are laws that exist that are not being implemented in the countries to map them out. But of course, this requires resources. And I think it relates to the earlier question on how can we bring the right kind of resources, the right kind of funding and technical support to member organizations at the national level so that they can have a strong voice, a strong network, strong capacity to influence policy, engage government, hold government accountable to some of their own laws, so that then communities can realize better land security. And indeed, one of the big challenges to attaining 30 by 30 is the extent to which there are still so many communities whose land rights is not established in their respective countries. And that needs to change for community-led conservation to fully contribute to 30 by 30. There was, Harriet, a question around calculating the cost of delivering 30 by 30 and whether there are countries that you may have come across that have done the same, or some as well, if anyone.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. It's a really good question. And I think, there's, and it links to some of the work that we've been discussing with the OECM specialist group across Africa to say, and particularly, it's on one hand, the formal protected estate is one thing, and understanding what that costs is. There's been some very clever people who've done work on that. I know, for example, the Keystone Initiative, which is being supported by the Walton Family Foundation, has looked at 162 parks across Africa, and they've worked out how much it's going to cost to protect it. It's much harder to think about again, with the diversity of governance systems that fall inside this community-led conservation space, much, much harder to work out what that's going to cost. But I've been, again, talking to some colleagues about trying to map some of that out. So the first step is to say, where are the potential areas where community-led conservation could contribute to 30 by 30? How can we map this out, especially in these large systems, like, for example, the CASA TFCA, and some of the other countries that are, actively supporting community-led conservation. So can we map those? And if we can map them, we can start to say, what's it going to take? What kind of resources, capacity, support do these communities need in order to continue doing what they're already doing so well? I'm afraid I don't have the answer. Probably it's been done in some countries elsewhere in the world, but yeah, I think we've got some work to do here.
Yeah, there is definitely some work to do, and there is also ongoing efforts in Gabon, in Namibia, and also in Kenya, where the governments of these countries, working with partners, conservation partners like TNC and WWF and others, have been developing project finance for permanence models to finance conservation, and there has been quite a bit of work to identify what those costs are, what those areas are, which ones are of priority, what is the funding gap. And so those countries of Namibia, Gabon, and Kenya, where the project for permanence projects are being developed, have made a good attempt. But that is a very valid question. We need to become much better in calculating the actual costs of managing the costs, and also deriving the benefits that will lead us to 30 by 30. I don't know, Sam, if you have any final point or any question that you'd want to contribute to as we come to the close of this webinar.
Yeah, I was just typing in the chat Bo's question, which I could have answered to Bo later, but it's just interesting. He asks, should we be explaining to community about 30 by 30? I just responded to say I wouldn't, but I would find something that they would care, something that has relevance to them and indirectly can help with 30 by 30. But I would not even attempt to go to community and say, do you know about this 30 by 30? Because it won't matter a thing to them.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Yeah, so there are places where you can raise the awareness, because if also the communities feel that they are contributing to something that works for them, but at the same time has global benefit, it also gives them the power to champion for their recognition, their support. So that's a debatable point that we can
Sure.
take beyond this.
Yeah.
I think there is also a question on OECMs, and the question from Guya on how KWCN, ILCN, and other networks supporting the global definition of effective area-based conservation measures. So OECMs are one of the tools for recognizing and mapping out and accounting for some of these areas that do not fit into the normal protected area approach. And this is an effort that we are currently working on with the government of Kenya and other partners to really understand what OECMs are by definition, and beginning to look at in countries which kind of OECMs will qualify, how they are monitored, how they can be monitored, and what principle, how these areas fit into this principle. So this is ongoing work, and you can get in touch with us after the webinar for a discussion on some of the lessons we are learning and progress that we are making. I don't know whether we still have Harriet. If you have any parting shot, but also Sam, as we come to a close.
And nothing more, Dixon. I was just going through these questions, some very interesting ones, and I'm sad that we can't go through all. There's a question here, very provocative, saying, but where do we get the resources to enable us to measure the success. And yeah, but it's interesting, but I don't know. It's like if your funders are not paying you to prove your impact, then there must be something wrong there. What are they paying for? If they're paying for you to achieve something, you should be able to evidence that thing, and evidencing that thing costs money. So yeah, well, I wish I was a funder, and I wish we had funders in the room to ask them where do we get the money to show the success, to show the evidence of the impact. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. There is an interesting question around tendencies that take advantage of local communities and how we can address them. And precisely the reason why we have this webinar today is how can we bring our collective voice from the different countries, West Africa, North Africa, how can we create a network of all conservation actors working under the community-led conservation model? How can we create a practice, a group of practice that is championing community-led conservation? How can we better define it, and how can we influence policy, but also influence the funding regimes to make resources available to the communities? This is why we are having this webinar. And really the reason why we want to encourage all of us who have been able to participate. I've seen we have had over 115 participants that have joined us. And this is really a welcome to you to join this small group of thinkers and practitioners who would like to see Africa driving community-led conservation into the future, making it mainstream, making it well-resourced, and even more importantly, making communities not just beneficiaries, but active participants of the conservation effort, and how these community conserved areas will add into the protected areas to really secure over 30% of Africa, both the terrestrial, the marine, the forest, and as representative as we can be. I'm sure this is not the last of these webinars. We have other partners and players and practitioners from different other countries that would like to bring to future webinars. So please stay in touch, and looking forward to connect with you as we join in the next webinar under the International Land Conservation Network. I'm glad and honored that the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies is now currently the Africa representative, and working very closely with Sam, who is my co-partner in designing this vision, and we have a network that is growing and beginning to expand, so that we can delve into some of these issues. We did not have the time to answer all your questions, but this recording is going to be available, and so and also the content in the chat will be summarized and will be shared, and we look forward to interacting with you as we go forward. So thank you so much. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Charlotte, for joining us in this webinar. And a really big thank you to ILCN. Robin, please pass our regards to your team. We really appreciate this opportunity to be able to engage on this important topic. We look forward to future discussion and some recommendations. I was quite impressed by a comment about creating a CLC Africa magazine. Those are future opportunities that we'd like to explore with you. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today.
Asante sana. Asante Dixon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Dixon. Bye.